My fiancée demanded I send my motherless children to boarding school so her alcoholic brother could live in their room. I ended the engagement. And months later, he stole $15,000 from her and vanished. I'm 38 years old. I work as an operations manager at a logistics company, and honestly, I need to get this story off my chest because I still can't believe I almost ruined everything for a woman who basically wanted me to send my kids to boarding school so her alcoholic brother could have their room. I know how it sounds, like something out of a bad movie, but I swear this happened to me just a few months ago, and I still wake up at night thinking about how close I came to making the biggest mistake of my life. I guess I should start at the beginning. My wife, Sarah, died almost 4 years ago from ovarian cancer. We had 2 kids, Caleb, who's now 12, and Hannah, who's 10, and when she passed away, it was like the world stopped. You know, that kind of pain you feel in your chest all the time that doesn't go away, even when you sleep. The first 2 years were brutal. We were learning to live without her. I was trying to be both father and mother at the same time, and honestly, I had no interest in dating anyone or anything like that. My life was work, the kids, their activities, dinner. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't miserable or anything. Actually, I found a certain peace in that routine, but there were moments when the loneliness hit me hard, like when the kids were already asleep, and I'd be alone in the living room, watching TV, without really paying attention to it. I met Stephanie about a year and a half ago at a barbecue that a work friend organized. She was 34, worked in marketing for a tech company, and honestly, I found her attractive from the first moment. Not just physically, but in the way she talked. Confident, but not arrogant, with that kind of energy that makes you want to be around her. We talked all night about all kinds of things. She made me laugh more than I had laughed in years. And when I mentioned my kids, she didn't put on that uncomfortable face that many women put on when I mentioned I was a widower with 2 children, but seemed genuinely interested. She asked for my number before I left, and I gave it to her, thinking she probably would never text me, but she texted me the next day, asking if I wanted to get coffee. We started dating casually at first. She understood that I couldn't see her all the time because my kids were my priority, and I liked that. It made me feel like she got it. Like 3 months passed before I introduced her to Caleb and Hannah, and honestly, she made a real effort to connect with them. She asked Caleb about his video games, played with Hannah, didn't try to force anything or pretend to be their mom, and I appreciated that. The kids told me later that they liked her, that she was cool, and that was like a huge green light for me because I'd been wondering for so long if I'd ever be able to have a serious relationship with someone without my kids feeling betrayed or uncomfortable. The relationship got serious fast, maybe too fast, looking back. But at the time, it felt right. It felt like I was finally living again, instead of just surviving. Stephanie started staying over some weekends. We'd cook together, watch movies, all of us, and I started imagining a future with her, like a real family again. After like 8 months, I proposed to her at the same park where Sarah and I used to take the kids when they were little. I know it sounds weird, but for me it made sense, like closing one chapter and opening another. She said yes, we cried. It was beautiful. The kids were excited when we told them, and I thought things were finally falling into place. But then weird things started happening. Stephanie began making comments about the house, like we needed to update the space and give it a more adult feel, which didn't seem bad at first because, well, the house had been the same since Sarah was alive, and maybe it was time to make some changes. But then she started saying more specific things like we should get rid of some of the kids' toys they didn't use anymore, that the playroom could become an office, that basically we needed to make space because when we got married, she was going to move in and bring her stuff. All that sounded reasonable, I guess, but something about the way she said it made me uncomfortable, like she was planning to erase the life we already had instead of joining it. And then Justin appeared. Stephanie had mentioned her brother from the beginning. She'd told me he was going through a rough time, that he'd lost his job like a year ago and was struggling to find something new. But I didn't give it much importance because, we all have that family member who's always in some kind of drama. I met him like 3 months after we started dating at a family lunch, and honestly, I disliked him immediately. Justin was 31 but acted like he was 21. He showed up late to the restaurant, smelled a bit like alcohol even though it was like 2 in the afternoon, and spent the whole lunch complaining about how unfair everything was. how companies wouldn't give him opportunities, how the world was against him. Stephanie constantly defended him, like making excuses for him, saying he was going through a rough patch and just needed time to find his way. Things got weird like 2 months after we got engaged. Stephanie started mentioning Justin more often, saying she was really worried about him, that he was living in a friend's basement, and that wasn't sustainable, that he needed a stable place to be able to focus on finding work. I'd nod and say understanding things, but inside I was thinking, the guy is 31 years old, he needs to figure it out himself. And then one day we were all having dinner, Stephanie, me and the kids, and she casually mentioned she'd been thinking about boarding school options for Caleb and Hannah. I froze with my fork in hand. The kids looked at her confused, and Caleb asked, "Boarding school? Why would we go to boarding school?" And Stephanie smiled and said something about it being a great experience for them, that they'd learn independence, that they'd meet people from all over the world, like it was the most normal idea in the world. I told her no, politely but firmly, that my kids weren't going to any boarding school, that they were staying with me. She made that face like I was being irrational and said, "Well, we can talk about it later," but I already knew something was wrong. Caleb came to me later that night and asked if I was really considering sending him away, and I could see the fear in his eyes, that fear that maybe his dad was going to abandon him for his new wife. I promised him that would never happen, that he and Hannah would always be my #1 priority, and he hugged me for like 5 minutes without saying anything. I had a serious conversation with Stephanie the following week. I asked her directly what this whole boarding school thing was about and why she'd brought up that topic in front of the kids. She sighed like she'd been expecting this conversation and told me we needed to talk about Justin. She basically explained that her brother was in a desperate situation, that he'd lost the place where he was staying and needed a stable space to be able to recover. I asked her what that had to do with my kids and boarding school, though I already knew the answer. She told me, "Well, if the kids are at boarding school during the school year, we'd have space for Justin to stay here. He could use Caleb's room, and that way, I could help him get on his feet while he looks for work." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, "Are you suggesting I send my kids away from their home so your adult brother can live here?" And she immediately got defensive, saying I was putting it dramatically, that it would only be temporarily, that the kids would come back during breaks, that it would be good for everyone. I told her that was ridiculous, that my kids had just lost their mother a few years ago, and the last thing they needed was to be ripped from their home and sent somewhere where they don't know anyone. She insisted I was being selfish, that I didn't understand how important family was. And I told her, "Exactly. That's why my kids are staying here. Because they're my family." The thing is that, after that conversation, I thought the subject was closed, that she'd understood that wasn't going to happen. But like 2 weeks later, Justin showed up at my house, literally without warning. I'd just gotten home from work. The kids were doing their homework in the living room, and this guy rings the doorbell with 2 big suitcases. I asked him what he was doing there, and he told me like it was nothing. Stephanie told me I could stay here for a while. Where's my room? I just stood there thinking, is this really happening? I told him there was a misunderstanding, that he couldn't stay here. And he got angry, started saying that Stephanie had promised him, that she'd told him everything was arranged. I called Stephanie right there in front of Justin and asked her what the hell was going on. She acted surprised, like she didn't know what I was talking about, but then admitted that yes, she'd told Justin he could stay because she assumed I'd changed my mind about boarding school. I told her I never changed my mind, that my kids weren't going anywhere, and that Justin needed to leave. She begged me to reconsider, that it was only for a few months, that Justin really needed this, and I told her no, this is my house, these are my kids, and this isn't going to happen. Justin started yelling at me, calling me selfish and other things, and I told him to leave before I called the police. He eventually left, dragging his suitcases and muttering things about me. That night I had another conversation with Stephanie, but this time it was different. She was no longer trying to convince me or explain her point of view. She simply gave me an ultimatum. She told me, "Richard, I need you to choose. Either you send the kids to boarding school and we help my brother, or this isn't going to work." I looked at her and asked if she was serious, if she was really asking me to choose between her and my kids. She said that's not how she saw it, that it was about making room for our whole family, but I told her Justin wasn't my family, that he was a 1-year-old adult who needed to solve his own problems. She started crying, saying I didn't understand family loyalty, that she'd always been there for her brother and expected her future husband to be too. I told her I wasn't going to do this, that if she couldn't accept that my kids were my priority, then we had no future together. I stood up, took off the engagement ring I was wearing. Yes, I wore one too, and gave it back to her. She just sat there in shock for a moment, like she couldn't believe I was really breaking up with her. And then she exploded. She yelled at me that I was selfish, that I was raising spoiled kids, that he was going to regret this decision. All kinds of hurtful things. I'm not going to repeat here. I asked her to leave my house, and she did, but not without first telling me this wasn't over. And she was right about that, because what came next was a nightmare. First, she sent me a detailed email demanding I reimburse her for her share of all the wedding deposits, the dress she'd already bought, the money she claimed she'd spent on things for the house, basically like $15,000. I replied that we could divide the wedding costs fairly, but I wasn't going to give her money for things she decided to buy for my house without me asking her to. And that made her angrier, and she started sending me messages saying she was going to sue me, that she had evidence I'd promised to pay her everything, which was completely false. But the worst part was when she started spreading rumors among our mutual friends, saying I'd been abusive to her, that I'd emotionally manipulated her, that I'd used my kids as an excuse to control her. Some friends wrote to me asking what had really happened, and I told them my version. But you know how it is. There are always people who prefer to believe the drama. I lost some friendships over that. People I thought knew me better but decided to believe her. Justin also started sending me threatening text messages, saying he was going to find me, that I was going to regret closing the door on him. Like things that almost made me call the police, but I decided to just block his number. Like 3 weeks after we broke up, Stephanie wrote to me again, but this time her tone was different. She sent me a long message saying she'd reflected, that maybe she'd overreacted, that she wanted to talk to see if we could work it out. I honestly considered responding to her for like half a second because part of me still remembered the good times. But then I thought about Caleb asking me if I was going to send him away, about how Hannah had started to relax again since Stephanie wasn't around anymore, and I realized there was nothing to fix. I responded, telling her I appreciated the message, but my decision was final, that I wished her the best, but there was no future for us. And then something happened that I didn't expect at all. Like 2 months after that, Justin stole thousands of dollars from Stephanie's bank account. I don't know exactly how he did it, if he had access to her accounts or what, but he basically left her in financial ruin. I found out because a mutual friend told me, saying Stephanie was devastated, that Justin had completely disappeared after stealing all her money, and she was trying to track him down unsuccessfully. Part of me felt sorry for her, honestly, because I imagine it's horrible to realize that the person you almost destroyed your relationship for ends up betraying you that way. But another part of me thought, well, this is what happens when you put toxic people above everything else. Last week, Stephanie showed up at my house. I hadn't talked to her in months. I'd blocked her number after the last exchange, so when I saw her car parked outside, my first reaction was to close the curtains and pretend I wasn't home. But she rang the doorbell several times and I finally opened. She looked bad. You know, tired. Dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept well in weeks. She asked if we could talk, and I told her we had nothing to talk about. She started crying right there on my porch, saying I was right about Justin, that he'd ruined her life, that she'd lost everything trying to help him, that now she understood why I'd been so protective of my kids. She asked me for help. Not money exactly, but like she wanted me to forgive her, for us to be friends again, that maybe we could even try again. I told her I was sorry for what had happened to her with Justin, that it was horrible and no one deserved that, but I couldn't help her. I explained that she'd tried to make me choose between her and my kids, that she'd tried to kick Caleb and Hannah out of their own home so her brother could live here, and that was something I was never going to be able to get over. She tried to argue that was before, that now it was different, but I told her no, that the person who was willing to do that once could do it again, and I couldn't risk my kids' stability for anyone. I closed the door and watched her from the window walk back to her car. She sat there for like 5 minutes before starting it. I don't know what she expected to find coming here. Maybe she thought I was going to feel sorry for her and rescue her, but honestly, all I felt was relief that she's no longer part of our lives. Caleb asked me who it was when he heard the doorbell, and I told him nobody important. He looked at me with that way 2-year-olds have where you know they don't believe you but don't want to push either, and then went back to his room. Things are good now, I guess. The kids are happy, stable, doing well in school. Caleb joined the soccer team, and Hannah is taking art classes. I went back to focusing on my work and being the best father I can be. Do I feel lonely sometimes? Yes, of course I do. Do I wonder if someday I'm going to find someone who really understands that my kids will always come first? All the time. But I also know I made the right decision. And every time I see Caleb and Hannah in their home, in their rooms, surrounded by their things and their friends, I know there's nothing I regret. They already lost their mom. They weren't going to lose their home too. Not for anyone.